SEO Nation, what's up? I want to share with you something that I actually just trained at Optimize Live. We're going to hit a couple things that those of you that offer SEO services, or actually any marketing services, it doesn't have to just be SEO, things to do to deal with client engagement. So the first thing that I was talking about the other day at Optimize Live is document all the gaps in client engagements. So like if you send the client a thing and they don't reply, and then you follow up and they don't reply, like track that. And so we have like a simple WordPress installation that's password protected, and it's just on a generic vanity domain that we give our team access to. And so what we do is we set up what's called campaign summaries, which is like a summary of just what it sounds like, the campaign that we're working on. And so every client has a campaign summary where it's who's the point of contact, what's the domain, what are the keywords we're targeting, business basics, information about who the point of contact is, things like that. Now, the other nice thing about having this on a simple WordPress installation is there's the built-in commenting system. And so you can enable comments and uploads since it's gated. And then what we do is anytime we send a client a thing and it becomes a pattern of them having a gap in communication or follow-ups, at some point they're going to blame you for that. So what you do is you document it. And so we'll take screenshots, just little JPEGs, or if it's a long one, we'll export an email thread as a PDF, and then we'll upload the PDF as a comment. And so that way you have a breadcrumb trail that has timestamps on it and is searchable. And so where this just came to life was we had a client that questioned us about a change that was made. And so before I tell you what that change is, the other thing I wanted to discuss is when you have significant updates being made to a website or a marketing campaign or something, advise the client on the pros and cons of the choices and make them decide which choice it is. So you don't make the decisions on significant things, and you put the liability on them. Now, let's take both of those together, documenting clients, communication, and passing on the decision making over to their liability. So what had happened is we had a client who, they were a lead like a year and a half ago, and then they came back a year later and we're like, oh, we tried this other person, it didn't work out. Well, let's work with you now. That was not a red flag, but kind of like a warning sign. And so we had a couple little exchanges like that. And it's mostly just with the owner. The point of contacts have been awesome. And so when they came back, the person that made an intro is all, from the year prior, is also, a friend and sends other intros. So I wanted to be respectful of that too. And so we ended up taking them on as a client, and then, but we started to have these gaps in communication and just little mild snarky comments that, most people would let slide, but are signals to greater problems down the road. So we started documenting those. And what had happened is we got to, in May, we started going, hey, somebody wiped out all the H1s and meta descriptions. And this is a big site, like thousands of pages. And so something small like that has a significant impact when it's replicated across thousands of pages. So we called it out because our audits went off, and we caught it, and we proactively communicated with them. Well, we ended up going back and forth with them, and they acknowledged that it was their fault. Like they made the change that messed things up. So they troubleshoot, they find the point of failure, fix it. A couple weeks later, goes off again. So we send them another update going, hey, a thing that happened a couple weeks ago happened again. And then, and so we're documenting this the whole time. Well, around the time it happened the second or third time is when we had pointed out before that they had a third-party sitemap. And so the sitemap was hosted on a separate domain. And so like if it was, y.com was the client, the sitemap was z.com/sitemap.xml. And that was something I don't recall seeing, but maybe once before in 20 years. And, but it did have their URLs. So even though it was z.com/sitemap.xml, all the listed URLs in the sitemap were y.com. But we noticed it wasn't accurate. It was feeding stuff that shouldn't be indexed. It wasn't updating properly and having stuff that should be indexed. And so by the time we got done with the priorities, we resurfaced that and said, hey, why not use the native sitemap that's built into the native commerce platform? And so we gave them the pros and cons, and we let them decide, and we documented it, because here's what's happened next. I just got this long email from the client. They weren't rude in tone of voice, but they were completely unprofessional in their approach. So their approach was, sitemap indexing failure, something like that in the subject line, and then it starts going in like, hey, I just wanted to address this owner to owner, which I can appreciate. But then it's like, in June, we had the sitemap switch over, and pointing the finger of, you guys made the change, you guys didn't report it, you guys didn't do this, you guys didn't do that. And I ended up having a handful of pages get de-indexed. Sitemaps don't get pages de-indexed. Sitemaps help search engines find the content, not rank it. And search engines don't forget the content if it was removed from a sitemap. You could delete your sitemap and not even have one, and it's highly unlikely there would be any movement on what pages are indexed. So they end up sending us this thing saying, because of the sitemap change that you guys made, our traffic decreased by XYZ. Now, there was a decrease in traffic, and I acknowledge that. And so what I ended up coming back saying is like, hey, thanks for bringing this up, and thanks for being candid. And their email was long, so my email was long. And so what I like to do is address their concerns directly, and preferably not introduce any other variables. In this case, I did, because I said, hey, once I address the sitemap and indexing, it sounds like there's some other things that you should know that you're not familiar with. And so I said, regarding sitemaps, they don't influence search engine rankings. They help search engines find content, not rank or forget it due to lack of sitemap. And you could delete a sitemap, and it's only going to affect Google's ability to find new content. But even then, it still won't prohibit it from finding it. It just may change the speed in which it finds it. But if your site's already getting indexed on a regular basis, it's going to find the new content anyway on your blog index. And search engines also are going to go through and find sitemaps in your robots text file, things like that. So I acknowledged that, and then I said, but that doesn't address the indexing, which did decrease. Here's the part where you should probably be brought up to speed, because it sounds like the team isn't, I can't remember what the phrase I used, but basically feeding, information back up the chain of command. And so that's when I was able to tap into our log on their campaign summary of miscommunications. And so I was able to show them screenshots of saying, we brought up the indexing issue before it became an indexing issue, saying, look at all these problems that keep happening to the website. They also switched it from www to non-www or vice versa. So they made some massive changes. Accidental things that have had a negative impact on SEO. They have constant JavaScript issues. When we inherited the site, it had tons of inline CSS. And so not only is the issue not applicable, it wasn't our judgment call. And so we have an email, it's pretty funny. The email, I sent them 4 screenshots, but the first one was like their team member straight up saying, TLDR, we want to go with moving the sitemap, right? And so they flat out made the judgment call, but losing my train of thought. So anyway, I was able to reply and address all these things and go, in addition, here's the kicker. They said, we understand this was a judgment call, and not all judgment calls go perfectly well, but we don't trust you anymore. Therefore, we're asking that you refund everything we've ever paid you. And like as if there wasn't any benefit prior to this, there's no ongoing benefit after this. But then that's where we come full circle about the red flags, right? Their gaps in communication, that they bailed on another agency and pointed the fingers at the previous agency, things like that. Anyways, long story short, the point of the story is have a repository for documenting client communications and, more importantly, gaps in communications. And second is make sure that your client is the one that is responsible for making judgment calls on significant decisions. And so document those decisions as well. So you can educate them on it. But we've gone so far as, especially after this, as not necessarily making recommendations. So it'll be like, here's the pros, here's the cons, and then let them decide. So pretty interesting thing, you know. And had I not done that, the implied liabilities they were seeking compensation for was like $130,000 to $180,000, which, you know, in the agreement would say you're not responsible if this was our fault. Another thing to take into consideration is your agreement should say that you can't be liable for more than the cost of services rendered. So like if you're charging $3,000 a month and you're, you know, 3 months into an engagement, that's $9,000. And if they want to say there's $100,000 in damages, then even if you really screwed up, you're only liable for the $9,000 that they paid. Which brings up, I guess, one last point is get business insurance. I didn't have business insurance I've been in this for 19 and a half years. I didn't get business insurance for probably the first 10 years because I didn't even think about it. And then all of a sudden when I thought about it, I was like, holy crap, I need to get on that right away. Now, the amount of business insurance will vary, but to give you context, you know, part of it's based on the industry you're in, part of it's based on the volume of revenue you do. And when I first got business insurance, it was around $2,500 a year. Now it's like $6,500 a year. And when I first got it and it started escalating to $3,500, $4,500, you know, I asked my broker, who's an awesome guy, if you guys need an intro to somebody who's neutral and is an independent broker, let me know. I've been working with him for like 17, 18 years. He's like, because I said, well, I don't really have a lot of liabilities because it's not like I'm, you know, an electrician that can burn down a house. He goes, no, but, and then he pointed out, you know, we can influence revenue. Like if we burn down a website, guess who's liable for the revenue lost while the site crashed? And then I was like, oh, that makes sense. And then also so it's not only covering your liabilities with clients, but the insurance also covers protecting your revenue if something were to happen, like, you know, I don't know in my case, but like let's say you were an electrician and somebody totals your van or all your stuff gets stolen, then you can't generate revenue, and so they'll offset that revenue. We actually had, some of you know that my wife, she is a licensed cosmetologist, and so before we had our first kid, we set up a salon and we were doing that, and we actually had the roof collapse in. And so business insurance covered the lost revenue over the weeks that it took to repair the roof damage. It's also now important, probably more than ever, with AI liabilities. So that's a whole other thing I talked about at Optimize Live is when we talk about insurance, is business insurance now has exclusions for AI liabilities. So you actually need you need your business insurance for the reasons I mentioned, but then you also need a cybersecurity insurance is usually what they generalize it as. And the cybersecurity policy will cover, potentially cover, depending on, you know, who you're with, liabilities created by automations and things like that. But what it also covers is, what's the phrase that they use? Basically, reputation damages. So let's say we publish a Google News feature, a press release, or an article that the client didn't approve, though that should never happen. You should have SOPs to prevent that. But if the client didn't approve a piece of content and went live and there was something factually incorrect that created a liability or, you know, affected their reputation, then that would cover that. So anyways, document things, make your client responsibility for decisions, and get business insurance.